Hello and welcome to the SANS APAC webcast series, SANS 8 Mobile Device Security Steps. My name is Ruby Souza and I will be moderating the webcast today. Your presenter is Crowley. Please feel free to submit your questions at any point by using the chat or questions tab, and a brief Q&A portion will take place at the end of the webcast. Thank you for your attention. Now let me turn the mic over to your presenter, Crowley.
Hi Ruby, thank you very much. I'm happy that people are able to attend. I hope that there's some time at the end for questions. I'm looking forward to that. I do have a lot of stuff to cover, so I wanted to go ahead and get started right away. Basically, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but for those of you who are in this space, I did want to mention that there are a couple of events coming up in the area where myself and my fellow SANS instructor Tim Medine will be instructing. I taught in Singapore last year, as well as in Canberra last year. This content is something that there's a very good response to people when they sit in the class. So these are available for you. And the thing that I'll be talking about today is, in many ways, the very highest level takeaway lessons that we discuss in the class. But in the class, we actually go into a good deal more detail, in addition to having specific technical components where we practice the actual techniques that we would use in order to go ahead and identify what some of the issues are. I also wanted to thank Mobile Iron for sponsoring the discussion today. I have heard good things about Mobile Iron from people who are using it. They're in the space. They have a couple of different products that help people to accomplish their objectives. In my mind, and you'll definitely get this sense as I go through and talk through things, the tools, the MDM, the MAM, the tools are useful for you to accomplish what it is that your organization needs to do in terms of actually working on securing mobile devices within your organization, but they are not the end of the process. In fact, they're just one component of a much larger process. And what today's presentation is about is providing you with a framework, a list, basically a checklist almost, to assure that you're doing the things that we think are the very most important things in order to address securing mobile devices for your organization. Okay, so the plan for today is a little bit of discussion about this top 8, just to start off and give you some context in terms of what it is that I'm actually talking about. What is this list? Where did this guy come up with this, right? That's basically some of the introductory content. And then I will go to the actual 8 steps that we recommend, briefly list them, and then go through and discuss each of them in some detail. This is something where as you're listening, please feel free to chat your questions. Ruby will collect them and we'll address them at the end. I know that you may have thoughts while I'm going through the presentation, but I'm not going to take questions in line as I'm talking through these components. So let's just start off in terms of our larger context. What are some extracted objective thoughts that we have about dealing with mobile security? One of which is that it's actually incredibly complex to work through the details associated with this. We've had a large number of attacks. We continue to see attacks against every mobile device platform. We have scenarios where it's oftentimes difficult to assess the impact to the organization for each of these attacks. It's difficult to understand how it is that an organization could defend itself when most of our mobile devices present very small opportunities for testing and evaluation. There are typically security controls built into the device, and people who are in the information technology space, who are in cybersecurity, who are in the responsible role for an organization, don't have a lot of authoritative information as to whether there is a problem or not. Okay? So this information is coming from open source resources that are trustworthy in many cases, but oftentimes these resources that are providing the information to us tend to have a distinct sort of way of confusing us. So we will have contradictory components that are actually coming out. We'll have people explaining things to us, and then as it turns out, it's more of a marketing push than it is really a true, tangible issue associated with our devices. Another thing that is tremendously challenging for end users especially, but in addition for organizations, is the constant churn of applications and trying to understand whether applications are in fact worthwhile to install on our mobile devices. And the challenge is that there are changes within the environment which create a circumstance that while an application initially might have been okay, there's a discovery of a flaw in the underlying operating system, or there's a discovery of a flaw associated with the API, the programmatic interface into the code that provides the mobile applications, that represents an attack against the application. And the application, while itself is not very vulnerable, the underlying development environment may have problems, and then attackers are able to exploit that. And then oftentimes the people that we turn to as our trusted advisors in terms of getting information, in terms of understanding what we can and cannot do, are the people who are trying to sell us products to resolve issues that we have. Now, vendors are in a fantastic position to be able to provide information to you as a customer. But you also need to realize that as a vendor, they have an agenda to sell more product. And so we will hear lots and lots of things from vendors, and at the end of the information that they provide, it is not always as tremendously successful a product as they might suggest. And in addition, the threat is at times not as potentially damaging as they suggest. Okay? So we have these three things. The fact that it's actually very difficult to do this work. It's confusing in terms of gathering information as we try to do this work. And then the people who are in a position to provide us with the best advice oftentimes have an additional agenda that we need to be aware of in order to help to protect our organization in terms of this. So what Josh Wright did, now Josh Wright is actually the course author for the SEC 575 class for SANS. And I am the lead instructor for the SEC 575 class for SANS. Josh does a tremendous amount of research and does not actually teach this class very frequently. While I also do a tremendous amount of research, I teach this class on the average 10 times a year. So this is the, when I mentioned Josh, he is a collaborator of mine in terms of the course, and he is the course author who is in a position to provide updates. And one thing that I'll mention toward the end of this discussion is one of the things that will be making its debut here in just a couple of weeks in Orlando. The course content actually develops very quickly. Every quarter there is an update, and there's typically one major enhancement in each quarterly update. And I'll talk a little bit about the application scorecard and the framework around performing application assessment toward the end of the presentation. So the idea was, and this actually started several years ago, in the time where not a lot of people did not have as much information as we have today. This was back in the time frame where, for me, my organization was transiting from essentially a singular deployment of BlackBerry devices. Okay, so we had BES, and we started with the influx of iPads. So iPad 1 was pretty much the first mobile device that where I was working at the time we really needed to specifically address other than the Blackberries. And even at the time we had a tremendous challenge understanding the Blackberries and the right things to do around all of the potential configurations. And so the issue in information security has often been we've got a lot of things that we could do, which are the right things to do. Right? Can I get somebody who can provide me with some authoritative advice on what are the right things to do? And so there was a top mobile security steps guide that was actually developed. And SANS, as an institution who is providing information, is in a fantastic position to provide a somewhat objective perspective on what are the right things to do. Now, that being said, as I mentioned earlier, there's always vendor bias, and so SANS, as a vendor, has training that it wants to sell to you, and that's something that you need to consider all the time when you look at the SANS content or any content from a vendor of some sort. Is you look at what's their bias, what are they trying to do. SANS has historically been fairly effective at delivering content that is vendor neutral. Okay? And so while this particular presentation is sponsored by a vendor, this content is my own. This is not something that the vendor has actually told me what to say. These are thoughts that are my own, as well as the collection of information from the community associated with SANS. And so the idea with this is that there was actually a request put out to people via one of the advisory board lists associated with SANS that said, hey, for those of you who are in process in your organization, we need your advice. We would like you to propose the things that every organization should be doing. And what we'll do is take all the information that we get from the community and then collect that and digest it and show the places where there are crossover and get the abstract notions of what everybody is saying that needs to be done. And what came of that was a guide that was 25 pages long. It had some good information in it. It was actually really good information that was developed several years ago. And what we were getting to were some abstract truths of what needed to be done. But at the same time, it was created in a form where it was essentially stale as soon as it was developed. Okay, so things were very contextual and specific to, say, concepts and operating systems and products that were available at that moment in time. And so what was attempted to do was to move from this less persistent and transient form to a more persistent form, something where we actually had a set of topics that we could, over time, revise, but essentially would be in a position to effectively stand the test of time. And that's what we came to this list with. Okay, so that's the background that helped us to arrive at these 8 items. And so these 8 items: enforce device passcode authentication, monitoring access and use, updating the devices on an ongoing basis, prohibiting third-party application stores, disabling debug access, evaluating compliance associated with applications, preparing a response plan for when the device is lost or stolen, and having the appropriate managerial and operational support were the items that it seemed that everybody was actually pointing to. These were the things that we said needed to happen. Okay? And we, being the larger we of the people in information security who are asked to participate in this particular listing. Now, some of these, you might look at that and say, well, that's obvious. That's obvious, of course you need to do that. But at the same time, in many cases, unless you have some authority to reference in your organization and say, this is what this group, who's a collection of information security experts, is actually saying needs to be done. Unless you have that authority to point to, you will have situations where you may not, in fact, be able to say, enforce passcode authentication, because users don't want that. Right? So these are the steps, and let me talk through some of the associated concepts of each of them. Now, the idea of passcode use is that passcode use presents a barrier to casual access to data. Okay? The more complex and robust the passcode implementation is, the more effective the barrier is. There is no barrier which will stop every attempt at dismantling it. Okay, so the intention of passcodes is to balance the user functionality that's necessary with the restrictions that are important for the data that's maintained on that mobile device. Let me mention one other thing about this list of items that I didn't mention, and I should have when I was on this slide, is that these items are prioritized. They're prioritized in terms of effectiveness and ease of implementation. So we're talking about the easier things first, and we'll get to the more complex components later. Okay? So I just wanted to highlight that the reason why they are in this order of 1 through 8 and the items on this list is that they're from easiest to implement to most difficult to implement. Now, with this, what you can do is identify data associated with mobile devices and then seek to implement protections that are appropriate to that particular data. So if the person's just using their mobile phone to access email, and that email access is used with another passcode in order to access that, you have a 4-digit PIN is probably good enough in order to actually protect that particular mobile phone. Is there the possibility that email still gets lost? Yes, absolutely. Someone can shoulder surf the PIN, someone can access the phone, someone can read the content on that phone after entering that passcode. But that's a risk that many organizations are consider to be a reasonable risk. I think that the fingerprint readers today, the way that most people rate those fingerprint readers is that there's essentially a rough equivalent to a 4-digit PIN. Okay, and so then here are some thoughts in terms of not just the length of the passcode, but the required complexity, and then how long that passcode is permitted to be used on the device, how many passcodes will be retained in terms of actually having passcodes that the user is not allowed to reuse, the restriction on the device in terms of how quickly that device locks itself, first of all, and then second of all, destroys the data on the device. So we have those maximum failed attempts, and if you have a device that has important data on it, there should be a mechanism by which that data is deleted if the device detects that someone is attempting to access it and is failing to access it. Now, this is very restrictive. If you look at the very strong, maximum failed attempts is 4 failed passcodes. I know when I'm in a hurry that I have typed my passcode 4 times incorrectly on my mobile phone. So with this, you have to be sure that your users understand that when they have very strong security applied to their phone, that they understand what is at risk for them for incorrectly entering the passcode. Now, there are a lot of attacks in the mobile device space related to passcodes, because in many cases, for many organizations, the only thing standing between an adversary And that adversary might be casual access. That might be someone just being interested in looking at it. That adversary might be someone's kid who's opening the phone and accidentally sending an email to a mailing list. That adversary might be a very motivated attacker who's attempting to commit industrial espionage, right? Your adversaries come in a lot of different forms. And so in many cases, the only thing between the adversary and the data on the mobile device is this passcode. And so it is an area of research where attackers develop capabilities in terms of actually undermining this. And so as an example, the Chaos Computer Club is one of many and they were the first for the Touch ID specifically, but actually published a methodology and proved that they were able to, given access to a good quality print of the user who had actually set up Touch ID on the iPhone, they were actually able to unlock it using that print stolen from an image of that print. Okay? And there are a number of different attacks against all sorts of other mechanisms of protection. Now, the next one is monitoring mobile device usage. And so it is really apparent associated with mobile devices that mobile devices are on all the time. And they have a tremendous amount of data that they actually convey relevant to their use. They log a tremendous amount of information. They log the messages that are sent. They log the physical location, in many cases, of the phone itself. And they may, in fact, transfer that information to the server associated with the phone. Now, when I talk about a server, I'm typically referring to a mobile device management platform. That is the way that many organizations are collecting information, but it also might be something as simple as your Exchange server. And so this is just a script that if you don't have a sophisticated mobile device management platform, but you do have Exchange as your email platform, you can use this PowerShell script to review your logs associated with your Exchange server and see what devices are actually connecting to your Exchange server and understand which ones are company-issued devices and which ones are devices that are actually mobile devices. So this is information that you should be collecting, gathering, and assessing. And if someone connects with a mobile phone and has been connecting with a mobile phone for some period of time, you could actually very easily adapt this script or create a script relevant to whatever data you have access to that would allow you to detect that the phone is no longer talking to your server. Now this may be normal, it may be okay, it may be acceptable. It may also indicate that the device has been lost. Okay? So a third item that's particularly important is the idea of patching mobile devices. For iOS, for Windows Phone, and for BlackBerry, this is much simpler than for Android. Okay, and I'm going to briefly talk about the issues associated with this. iOS, Apple controls the hardware, the operating system, and effectively controls the applications as well. Now, developers create applications and sell them on the App Store, but Apple has the position in order to approve or disapprove applications that are going to be put onto iOS. Windows Phone doesn't have as large of a market share, and the updates are actually getting better. However, the challenge with Windows Phone associated with updates is that Microsoft, who controls the operating system, does not actually manufacture the hardware where that operating system runs. And so then you have a handoff between the operating system vendor and the hardware vendor, who is then going to tailor code, and then that code is going to be handed off to the mobile operator, the cellular network, who is then going to tailor additional code and deploy that. Now, BlackBerry is similar in some ways to the Windows Phone, except for the BlackBerry company actually maintains hardware development and then the operating system, and then interfaces with the cellular operators who will go ahead and add code to the operating system before it gets pushed out. But this really is the, in my mind, the single biggest problem for Android. For Android, unfortunately, what we have is a tremendous fractionalization within the mobile devices that are actually deployed. So this is an older chart, but this reference that's in here actually shows a chart, and it's month-wise for each Android device was the latest major version of the operating system available for that particular piece of hardware. And for most of those devices, after the second month of the phone's release, that phone was at least one major version behind. Okay, so this is really terrible. Okay? And what a couple other data points tell us is that a lot of the threats associated with malware targeting Android actually could be resolved if the Android devices were on the latest major operating system. And according to the Android developer page, and I pulled this recently, right, the current state of deployed operating systems suggests that approximately less than 5% of Android devices in the world are actually running the latest major operating system. And this is really frustrating because the latest major operating system provides some tremendous security enhancements for the platform. But because of the fact that Android devices get their updates through the Open Handset Alliance, and that update is pushed to the mobile manufacturers, and then the mobile manufacturers push that up to the cellular providers, there are many Android mobile phones that are essentially abandoned at some earlier version of Android and will likely never get the update. Okay? And so this is the reality of this. And in fact, I have seen, and I've seen this worldwide, but I'll just constrain it to the United States, which is where I am at the moment. I've seen that on mobile devices, we frequently will have the same phone on different carriers, so different cellular providers, and you get one operating system that gets updated on that same model of phone, whereas on a different cellular provider, it's at a substantially older version. Why? Because that's within the power of the cellular provider to decide. Okay? So you need to keep an eye on updates as they come out. You also want to, in terms of protecting the devices and protecting your data on the devices, you want to prohibit third-party application stores. Now, on Android, this is a scenario where Android actually has the ability to disallow third-party app stores. However, the reality is that a user can simply override that. On iOS, it's much more difficult in order to accomplish that. The user must actually implement a jailbreak in order to be able to access third-party app stores. So in terms of Android, the default configuration is to disallow unknown sources. As you see here, you go into settings, then security, then unknown sources should be unchecked, but in many cases, users will be advised to turn that on to install something specific, and then they leave that on, right? And they just leave it there, and that's the state of the phone. And so if the user is presented with an opportunity to install a third-party app from an unknown app store, in other words, something other than the Google Play Store, they're at greater risk. As of Android 4.1, and it is actually, after it came out, has been pushed into the Play the Google Play application, there's now actually some protection in terms of checking to see if that application is known to be malicious. Another item is the concept of actually disabling developer debug access. Now, all phones have some capability to connect them via a USB device in order to see the content on that phone. Before we had smartphones as the ubiquitous platform, you actually typically had to do this over a serial connection, and there would be different cables that you need in order to pull content off of phones. But in the smartphone scenario, we've basically settled on USB connectivity. The phone represents an opportunity to actually get some enhanced access because there are developers in the world who need to be able to do more things than a standard user. And so in Android, you have an opportunity to go ahead and enable debug options. In iOS, you actually have an opportunity to configure the phone as a developer phone and then run code that is not in the main App Store approved by Apple. Likewise, for Windows Phone, you can actually, if you have a developer license from Microsoft, you can developer unlock a Windows Phone, and with this you can then actually run unsigned code. Likewise for BlackBerry, this represents a vehicle for developers to actually test that their code runs correctly. Now, if a user wants some additional functionality, and the user is smart enough to go read about how to enable this enhanced access level, the user can actually operate the device at a greater degree of risk than is actually necessary. So developer debug access is necessary for developers to do what they need to do. However, we want to make sure that users who are operating in standard user mode don't operate in this developer mode, because oftentimes this access level is used as the initial entry point into the mobile device in order to conduct additional attacks, which would include extraction of data or potentially exploiting the device in order to see if or exploiting the device in order to gain even further access beyond what the developer mode would actually allow. So in terms of Android and iOS, modern versions both provide prompts, even if some level of USB connectivity is available. However, older versions, say in iOS 6, if I connected over USB to an Apple iPhone running iOS 6, I could actually see data associated with applications. And in the Android space, I could actually go ahead and, if I do get access over USB, I can then potentially get a shell using the Android debug bridge and then attempt to deliver a code, some shell script or an executable or a library that then allows me to exploit the device and gain further access. Okay. Furthermore, many of the forensic tools will actually rely on some additional layer of access over USB. Okay, so many of the instructions associated with collection of a mobile device entail first changing that device configuration so that the device is in developer mode in order to allow the forensic tool to go ahead and extract content off of the device. Okay. Another thing that we recommend, and is a consensus thought related to mobile platforms, is look at the applications that are going to be installed on those mobile platforms and assess whether these applications are suitable for protection of the data that would be put on the mobile phone, and identify if there are additional mitigations required in order to protect the data for these particular applications. Now, this is something that there are a bunch of tools that are out there, but the largest problem in this for organizations tends to be having a good program associated with performing this application security compliance. So a couple of tools that are out there. iOS is very challenging to do application assessment because Apple does not expect that you would be doing that. So to be able to access the platform in order to see content on the operating system that's relevant to the information that we as information security professionals would want is actually nearly impossible unless you jailbreak an iPhone in order to perform the application assessment. There is an opportunity. You can always watch the network traffic moving on and off of that mobile device, but that network traffic does not tell the full story about the risks associated with running a particular application. And so this is a particular challenge for people working in this space, is working with iOS devices. On Android, we have, it seems, that more tools in order to accomplish this. With Android, this Now Secure mobile security application does a quick security assessment of the mobile phone. Okay, so it gives you just a basic assessment of the device. It doesn't do what people think of as antivirus. What it does is it says, I looked through the stuff on this phone, and here's what I think in terms of the risk associated with this particular phone, its current configuration, and so on. So I've tested this, and I've installed this Now Secure on a rooted Android device, and it identifies, hey, there's root. It also identifies some of the traffic that's actually moving back and forth on the devices unencrypted and so on. Now, it doesn't tell you the full picture, but it's a nice way for a free tool to get a barometer, a temperature reading of the device, of the Android device. When you start to get more complex in terms of doing assessment of the Android device, one of the things that's absolutely necessary to assess is the inter-process communication associated with applications, and these on Android devices are called intents. So there's a framework called Drozer, and so Drozer actually provides us with the opportunity to go ahead and see components that actually are on the device and then attempt to interact with the components that are actually exposed by that particular application, because it's possible that one application could speak to another application and potentially exploit it. So you might have an app on your Android device, like a flashlight, that doesn't have any network connectivity permission, and you don't have any permission on that flashlight to actually send SMS messages, but that application, using the intents and the other applications that are present on that Android device, can potentially have information from the device moved off of that device. Okay. So in order to address this, this is what I mentioned earlier was the recent update for SEC 575. There are always updates that get put into the device, minor tweaks and additional exercises or enhancement of exercises. But in this iteration, the major component that was an update was this application scorecard that gives a specific set of actions to assess, right? So it asks a number of questions, and we have an iOS and an Android report card developed for the class. Josh has done a phenomenal job looking at the common flaws associated with applications, and then actually producing those flaws in a way that an information security professional, given the correct tools and the correct platform for assessment, could actually go through and check all these things on the devices. And then in checking these things, you can get a sense of how well the application will perform for you. I will tell you that most of the ones that we've looked at so far have been in the C's and D range. If this is A is the very best, B is pretty good, C is not very good, D is pretty much unacceptable. That's kind of where we're seeing lots of C's and D's. And yeah, we're being hard on the applications, but it's your data. You would hope that the people who are doing the assessment are hard on the applications. We just don't want to acknowledge, oh, well, it's just a little bit of data that's leaking over the network because they aren't encrypting it. Maybe it's not such a big deal. Another item that we really need to consider is the notion of having an incident response plan for mobile devices when they're lost. Many of you are probably hearing this and thinking, yep, I've lost my mobile device previously. One thing that I would recommend is that you, within your organization, have good statistics about how many devices you've actually lost. And there are a couple of ways that you should assess this. Number one is user-reported information, and number two is log-collected information. And then compare whether users are actually reporting that they've lost devices or not. Because you can see if those devices are still connecting to you. And in many cases, the devices are not actually still talking. And so we have a unique set of issues associated with mobile devices. I actually, just as an aside, I'm actually the course author for another SANS class. It is a 2-day incident response team management class. And I have found that while there are generalizable components associated with lost and stolen mobile devices, you still have to customize your IR capability. Besides having that whole incident response framework in place, you still need to have specific mobile actions that you're going to take, and there are distinct risks and response activities that are necessary for mobile devices. And then the final thing that we have on our list, which is last because it is tremendously difficult to accomplish, is the idea of having operational and managerial support for your mobile device use within the organization. And this entails having a tiered hierarchy of corporate issued and BYOD accepted devices, having configuration capability to assert that certain devices are allowed whereas others are not. For the devices that the organization does own and is actually responsible for, to assure that those devices are kept up to date, to have a device management platform that is in use, that is monitored on an ongoing basis. Another class that I teach for SANS is the SEC 511, the continuous monitoring class. And it's interesting in my mind, I actually see the convergence of mobile and continuous monitoring through some form. It's not exactly the MDM that we have today, but I see some monitoring form whereby we are assessing the data that's moving from our organization to our mobile devices and to our cloud resources for retaining the data that we control. Okay? That is the continuous monitoring of the future. And today, it looks like an MDM and some mobile devices and some cloud stuff, but it's disparate. But I actually see within the next year more of a convergence of data monitoring, so essentially data loss prevention monitoring built into mobile platforms and mobile device management platforms. Okay, so this is where an organization can either be very effective and very proactive at protecting their information resources, where they can be absolutely lost, they can have no clear picture of what it is that they intend to do, they don't understand the devices that are on their network accessing their data, and they're essentially leaking information all the time. Okay, so these things are things that unless you work in an organization where management actually sees the vision of what this represents for the organization, then you can either be very successful and survive as a business and thrive as a business and provide good, effective tools that are business enablers, or you can act like a leaky ship and continually lose data and lose data. Okay? And so this is a scenario where it's very much a question of survival and accomplishment in your business area. So going forward, just a couple of things. I'm always interested in what people are doing. If you've done something in your organization that you think is particularly effective and you're able to share that with me, I would like to hear it. Okay? Because I can then share that information with other people, and that will give people ideas about what things that they can do. Likewise, if you have problems and you can't solve things, I'd be interested in hearing what they are. I can't promise you that I can give you an easy solution to the problem, but me being in a position where I have access to a lot of different organizations and a lot of different information, sometimes I'll make a suggestion that will set you down the correct path in order to get to a resolution for you. And then if you, say, get the application report card stuff going, or if you're currently doing something in your own form, like an application assessment, I'd be happy to hear what it is that you're doing. Okay? And if you can share the specific results of what you've performed, that would be even better. So I realize this was just a brief time of discussion, and I've only been talking for about 45 minutes now. But I'd like to, first off, thank you for listening. Second off, I'd encourage you to, in the chat window, right, in the chat window on the screen, go ahead and start typing in questions if you haven't done so already, and Ruby will organize and then remove duplication of questions. If you have specific technical questions for me, or you would like to share some information with me, you can email me. The chris@montans.com email is the one to use. And then beneath that, as what's on the screen, the @ccrowmontans is actually my Twitter handle, and you're welcome to go ahead and talk to me on Twitter. That also is a very effective way. Now, I mentioned a lot of different things throughout this exercise. Throughout this presentation. I have a couple of links here, and don't worry, you don't need to write these down. You will be able to actually download a PDF associated with this. And the easiest way to get this PDF, I actually have it online already. SANS will also make it available. If you go to this bit.ly link at the bottom, bit.ly/crow, which is like my last name, cell, as in cellular, and eads. This actually leads you to a directory on Google Drive that has a few presentations that I've developed. This one included. Okay, and then the other thing that I encourage you to take a look at is the SANS Sec 575 page that's at the top. There are a number of classes that are going to be in the Asia Pacific area, and if you have the opportunity and the inclination to attend, I'd go ahead and encourage you to do that. So while we're aggregating questions, I'd like to ask John to go ahead and discuss a little bit about Mobile Iron and go ahead and thank them for that, and then mention a little bit about the upcoming classes.
Thank you, Chris. Well, my name is Sean Georgette, and I am the Director for Asia Pacific for SANS. And I would like to thank Chris for taking the time to presenting on the 8 mobile essentials. And I'd like to take the time to thank Mobile Iron for sponsoring this webcast. If you have any questions or want to find out more about Mobile Iron, please check out their website. It's indicated on this slide, or you can contact them directly at the email presence. We'd really like to thank Mobile Iron for their support, and we look forward to some future webcasts with them as well. Next slide, Chris. And as Chris mentioned, parts of his presentation, he's highlighted we do offer a mobile device security and ethical hacking course in the APAC region. We have it scheduled in Canberra, July 6th to 11th, where actually Chris will be our instructor. We have it in Bangalore, September 28th to October 3rd, and we have scheduled it in Singapore from October 19th to 24th. If you would like any more information on that course, you can email it at us at asiapacific@sans.org, or please check out our website at www.sans.org, where we have all the information on those courses and other SANS courses. Thank you very much for attending. Please send us some of your questions, because we do have a few minutes where we can address some issues that you might have.
Okay, this is Ruby Souza again. We have a question. We have a few questions, Chris. The first one is regarding data transported across cellular networks. What about the confidentiality and integrity of data across cellular networks?
So cellular networks, in my mind, actually represent a more effective alternative to Wi-Fi networks for protection of data. Most cellular networks are actually instrumented in order to provide law enforcement inspection of content. And the other thing to really highlight and identify is the fact that the cellular provider is in a position to view and monitor all communication going across that network. So you do need to actually take protection to, spend some effort to protect data as it's moving across that cellular network. The idea is that your corporate information is actually at risk as it's transiting these networks. That being said, while cellular is actually a primary avenue of communication, there are different forms of cellular. So you have 2G cellular, 3G cellular, and 4G cellular. And the 3G and 4G cellular protocols are actually substantially more protected over the 2G communication that's actually being used. So in many cases, if you have a phone and you see a little indicator where it's on 3G versus 4G, and then later you see that that phone has actually moved over to 1X and has fallen back into an alternate mode, you may actually have a greater risk of interception, manipulation, and loss of data. Actually, in that same link where I pointed to the content for this particular slideshow, they have another slide deck that I put in there. That is actually a slide deck associated with some research that I did around cellular eavesdropping and cellular manipulation, and that actually formed the basis for a chapter that I contributed to a book that Josh and Johnny Cash recently released, which is Hacking Exposed, actually the updated version of Hacking Exposed Wireless, which is the 3rd edition. So I have a chapter in there on cellular communication, and there are a number of additional discussions of attacks against wireless. And cellular really as an architecture represents a lot of good protection that's been implemented. Wireless represents cheap, easy, and relatively ubiquitous access. However, the biggest problem I see with wireless, okay, so your Wi-Fi communication, is that each of these Wi-Fi networks is its own untrustworthy platform. And so whereas cellular is typically maintained by a single company, and the company may have bad practices, but those are essentially internal to just that one company. As you go and use Wi-Fi and move around the world, each Wi-Fi access point that you connect to represents a new opportunity for a different organization to eavesdrop or manipulate data that you're using and sending on your mobile device. Okay, so that's just a really brief discussion of it without any actual technical references, because I don't really have time to go into the technical underpinnings of it. But the basis is for cellular 2G is essentially untrustworthy. 3G and 4G are more trustworthy, but you just need to acknowledge that the network itself actually represents a threat to your data.
Okay, thanks, Chris. One more question. Is it possible to hack an Android device using ADB when my phone is not rooted and does not have a password set up?
Okay, so the question is it possible to, and you said hack, but I'm going to change that slightly. The way that I'm going to answer it is more around accessing data associated with an Android device. So on an Android device, if I were to simply pick up your phone, and this last part of the question was there's no passcode set on the Android device. If I were to pick that up, I could do a couple of things. First of all, just using the phone itself, I could review the data that's on the phone, read emails, send text messages, send attachments, and so on. However, an option that I would have is to potentially enable debug mode, so developer mode on the phone, and then go ahead and once I've enabled developer mode to enable USB debugging, and then start extracting data off of the phone. So generally, and there may be something that's on some individual device that prohibits this, but generally, an Android phone with no passcode, I could easily, with no sophisticated attack whatsoever, enable the correct configuration to allow Android debug mode to connect over USB, and then use that to pull data. Now, it's important to realize that ADB access is non-privileged access, so it's not root level access initially, but most, or I won't necessarily say most, but many exploits actually use the Android debug access mode in order to then deliver code that is used as a local privilege exploit that then provides further access to the phone, including rooting it. Okay, so hopefully that answers the question. In short, yes. If you don't have a passcode on your phone, I can configure it to get in over USB to use ADB to access the data on Android.
We're getting a few more questions, and if you have time, Chris.
Yep.
Okay. One was, is it possible to avoid Verizon tagging my TCP /IP packets when they are transversing Verizon data network?
So typically, in terms of data traversing a cellular network, okay, that data, when you send it on your cell phone, and I'm going to generalize it rather than a single cellular provider, I'm going to generalize it. Typically, once that data leaves your cell phone, it transits across a network that's entirely out of your control. So, in essence, no, if they wish to monitor the traffic that's leaving your device, they're in the position to do that. That is the architecture of 3G and 4G networks, is it provides for monitoring of IP traffic that's sent across that network. Okay. And you said there was another question, Ruby?
Yes. What sort of mechanisms are available for securely authenticating mobile devices?
So mechanisms for securely authenticating mobile devices. I think what this is asking, because there are a lot of different authentication capabilities. Let me actually just talk about the different authentication capabilities. So first off, there's authentication capability in terms of accessing the device itself. So the mechanisms for the device itself include PIN, passcode, facial recognition, swipe capability, and fingerprint recognition. Okay, those are the general ones that you have in generally available commercial phones. Then, in addition to that, you have some opportunities for authenticating the mobile device for traffic coming from the mobile device. So you can do things from the mobile device like using an 802.1x supplicant in order to do authentication, which is in software on the mobile device itself. Okay. You also can use for traffic that's coming from the device to authenticate to some resource, again, PIN and passcode. And then now we're seeing more two-factor authentication capability. Google Authenticator is one example of that. The Azure cloud services from Microsoft also have a two-factor authentication mechanism. And then yet another thing that cell phones are used for quite a lot is the notion of MTANs, or Mobile Transaction Authentication Numbers, which essentially is a one-time use code sent over SMS messaging. And this is either SMS messaging or over a telephone call to a pre-authorized number in order to deliver the one-time use code, where that code is then put into typically a web application. But the cell phone, the telephone number associated with that cell phone, is the unique vehicle of communication in order to deliver that one-time information that then gets used on the on that web application. That being said, we have actually seen examples of malware associated with attempted theft of mobile transaction authentication numbers, and the two most common examples of this are Zitmo and Spitmo. So Zitmo is the Zeus in the mobile, and Spitmo is SpyEye in the mobile. Malware that's associated with financial fraud that is basically stealing money from banks. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question. I tried to cover a lot of different topics. Yeah.
He had said more specifically he's looking for how to identify the same device as opposed to the user on it.
Okay, so the same physical device, actually one mechanism that's used quite a bit for that, for the device itself, if you are the cellular network, you can actually use a protocol called EAP-SIM, which allows for, it's an authentication using the SIM card that is the EAP, Extensible Authentication Protocol. You can actually use the SIM card in order to perform an authentication. So that's the opportunity. And then the cloud services like Google Authenticator and Azure. But then actually another example is on iOS. As of iOS 8, the Touch ID, you have the opportunity to use Touch ID at the application now instead of just at the operating system. So implemented in iOS 8 is an API that you can extend the functionality of Touch ID to applications. So in order to assert that the device, that the user is present, your application can require that the user authenticate using the fingerprint.
Okay. I think this is our last question. They ask, have you had time to review the more and more popular UI, MIUI, likely introduced with the Xiaomi devices? After installation, it will introduce a few OS software such as Security-App, which handles an array of functions as permissions, anti-malware scanning, and removal of cache files.
Yeah, so for that specific one, I have not actually reviewed that. If the person asking that question wants to send me the details of that, I'll see if I can take a look at it and get a sense, because I'm wondering, they probably have some specific use case for it, so they can send me details directly, and I'll see if I have a chance to look at it real quick and then provide some feedback on it.
Okay. That looks like that was our last question, so if no one has any other questions, I just want to say thank you so much to Chris, to Sean, to Mobile Iron for the great presentation and for bringing this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, visit sans.org/webcast, or you can email us at asiapacific@sans.org. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast. Bye, everyone.